Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, January 24th, 2024. We are in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 8, verse 1. Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the men of Israel came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and the Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place. And they are still there today. There is nothing in the ark except the two stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord had made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. When the priest withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priest could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Okay, so Solomon goes about doing the dedication of the temple correctly. He had learned his lessons from his father, King David, who in great exuberance had moved the tabernacle and its furnishings incorrectly and had somebody die, and then they'd done their research and found out they did it wrong and they did it correctly. And he learned from his father's tales, I'm sure. He may have been present. If so, he was probably fairly young and very impressionable. So he did it right. He called everybody together, all the political authorities in the whole land, everybody, every tribe, every government official, and then he got the priests to do their job right. And they didn't just bring the Ark of the Covenant. They brought everything that was in the tabernacle, everything, including the tent itself, that was where David had put it. And they brought it, they said, up from from Zion, the city of David. At that point in time, Mount Moriah, where the temple was built, was outside the walls of what was then Jerusalem. David had basically not built any walls. He had repaired walls, but he didn't. He'd captured Jerusalem and he'd made it his capital, but he didn't do anything else. The Temple Mount was outside the city, and it was agricultural land at that time. And he picked it as the Temple Mount because that's where he saw the angel of the Lord at the plague. And he bought it from a Jebusite. He paid full price for it. And he had the priest offer sacrifices there, and that stopped the plague. And he was pleased. And Nathan the prophet told him that's where the temple would be built. And so that's where he began preparations and storage of materials and that kind of thing. He made sure it was going to be available. That's where Solomon built it. Where his father had said, where Nathan the prophet had said, who Nathan had a lot of influence on Solomon, we can tell. Nathan was, of course, the prophet that said that while Solomon was still in the womb, this man will be God's king, and he will, be honored of God and be a man after God. Well, be the man God wants him to be, and be blessed of God. And so, he pays a lot of attention to Nathan. We don't hear much about Nathan after Solomon gets appointed king, anointed, and is on the throne. But it's pretty obvious because he's one of the people that anoints Solomon. He's going to be important in Solomon's life, and he's going to pay attention to what this man has said in getting the temple going. Nathan at that point in time would be fairly old and may not have lived long enough to see the temple constructed, but he had done the job God meant him to do. So it becomes a celebration to bring stuff up, and they didn't bother to try to keep count of how many sheep and goats and cattle they sacrificed. They were going to feed the whole crowd. They were basically going to try to feed all of Israel, and they were honoring God, and they sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed, and they just kept going. The expense was not the big thing. Solomon already felt wealthy enough that it didn't matter what the expense was. We're going to do this right. We're going to make sure everybody celebrates. And the implication from how it's stated is they would walk some distance, they would sacrifice another animal, they would burn the part that needed to be burned, they would cook the rest and distribute it. But by that point in time, they've walked another certain distance, and another couple of priests would sacrifice an animal, and just continually sacrifice an animal every, so far. And it's not a long walk in one sense. It is, at that point in time, out of the city of David, out of Zion, off of Mount Zion, which was one of the mounts in Jerusalem, to Mount Moriah, where, of course, Mount Moriah is also where Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice, and God then showed him the ram. And up until this point in time, it's never been in the city. It's always been outside the city. And Solomon has built the temple out here. And he's built it so it's on the highest point in what's now Jerusalem. But at that point, it's the highest point near Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a much more defended city. They'd picked the spot where it was easier to defend. It wasn't the absolute highest point, but Mount Moriah was a more gentle slope. It didn't offer itself natural defenses. Sure, it was higher, but absolute height was not the most important thing. Mount Zion was only, a few dozen feet lower, and it had much steeper sides, and it was easy to build a wall where it wasn't steep and build across things and enclose and make it a fortress. Mount Moriah, on the other hand, was easy access as far as a mountain goes. It was easy to climb. So it made a better place to put a temple instead of a fortress. You're not trying to keep people out of a temple. You want people to come to a temple. And besides, it's where God picked. David may or may not have known that when he bought it, that the threshing floor he bought was on Mount Moriah. He may or may not have made that connection. There's no indication he did. We're not sure if Solomon made that connection, but I would expect him to, since he was a learned man. And if he did, he would have understood that God had picked, by sending the angel to that spot, to pick the same spot where the sacrifice of Isaac had been carried out, that was to be the place of sacrifice. And so it was built there. They described the placing of the ark in there and where it was visible and where it wasn't. And basically, only the priest could see it, because only the priest could go into the holy place to see it. In the holy place, they could see the poles that carried it sticking out through the door. Now, they wouldn't stick out through the door, but you could see them through the door into the Holy of Holies. The high priest would get to see the ark once a year. And so it gets put in there. At this point in time, the only thing that's left in there is the stone tablets Moses had made that had the Ten Commandments on them. The jar of manna was gone. Moses' rod was gone. So some of the artifacts that had been put in it as a remembrance of the great acts of God are gone, and all they have is the law. So I don't know how we know that, because when people looked into it, they generally got killed. I don't know if in the process the priest said, hey, we got to clean this up. They prayed, they cleaned it up. In the process, they had to take the lid off, and when you do that, you see what's in there. It may have been that when the people had looked in and died, people had saw what was in there and remembered. We don't know exactly how that happened. God does expect us to respect Him and His stuff. And this is clearly God's covenant and God's ark and His mercy seat in His temple that Solomon built, and in His tabernacle that he had Moses build. And so the Ark of the Covenant is the piece that connects the temple back to the tabernacle. There were things that were made for the tabernacle that got carried into the temple. Some of the, utensils that were used in the tabernacle. But a bunch of new utensils were made for the temple. New building, new utensils, that makes sense. Probably a lot of the old ones, let's face it, they're 400 plus years old. If they've been used daily like they should have been, they're getting old, they're getting worn out. It's time to replace them. If they're still functional, you may not have enough functional pieces for this new, bigger venture. Even if you use the old ones, you're going to want new ones. And Solomon, in all of his planning and organization of this, had made that. And we looked at that in chapter 7. All the things that were made. And they put them in too. And when they got finished with that, then God dedicates the temple. His Spirit fills it, the cloud fills it. And this was the symbolization to them that God accepted it just like He accepted the tabernacle in the wilderness when His cloud filled it. Just like He had covered Mount Sinai when He was speaking to the people. Just like He had been a cloud that a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night when He was leading them through the desert. His presence filled the temple. Um, so God's glory filled the temple, and he accepts it, and he accepts that this is his place on earth to meet with men, and men to meet with him. Verse 12. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. Then he said, "Praise be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his own hand has fulfilled what he promised with his own mouth to my father David. For he said, Since the day I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe of Israel to have a temple built for my name to be there, but I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. My father David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But God said to my father David, Because it was in your heart to build a temple for my name, you did well to have this in your heart. Nevertheless, you are not the one to build the temple, but your son, who is your own flesh and blood. He is the one who will build the temple for my name. The Lord has kept the promise he made. I have succeeded David my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel just as the Lord promised. And I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. I have provided a place there for the ark in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our fathers when he brought them out of Egypt." So he's making this, in essence, a political speech, but he's also making it a religious speech to the people, where, in verse 12, he's kind of exclaiming. He's just, he's got knowledge of the past, and as God fills the temple, and it's a miraculous thing, and for 7 years they've built it. They know that the building doesn't generate a cloud. They know that's God doing it, and God puts a cloud in there. Jerusalem is a fairly dry place. Think High Plains of Texas, Panhandle. You're not going to expect a building on the top of a hill to suddenly have a cloud in it. It's just not the way things go. That's not the way the natural world works. So they know it's miraculous. And Solomon makes this exclamation. He realizes this is God filling the temple, and God dedicating it, and God, I'm sure he had planned a dedication ceremony, etc., etc. This speech was probably part of that planning. It's a planned speech. He made sure that the people understood that that was God's doing, that God had promised it, and now it's happened, and that's part of why they should support him as king, because God had promised it to David. David was the great king that gave him safety, and now Solomon has fulfilled what God had said that he would do. And he now has a place for his name to dwell. He makes the simplification that God dwells there. God does not actually dwell in the temple. He may meet people there, but God is infinite, and God does not need a temple to dwell on the earth. God will dwell wherever he wants to. Now, he may choose the temple to meet with people so that they know where to meet with him. But from a Christian viewpoint, we know God dwells with every true believer wherever they are in the world. So God will dwell with you, God will dwell with me, God will dwell with my friend that's in Houston. God will dwell with my friend that's in Indonesia. God will dwell with my friend that's in China. God will dwell with, you name the spot. And if there's a true believer there, God is dwelling there too. And God will meet with anybody, anywhere He chooses to. And that was true then too. On the other hand, He also knew us as humans that, if we said, God can meet you anywhere, pretty soon everybody would be out on the lake on the day of worship, catching fish, claiming they were meeting with God when they're not meeting with God. They're taking advantage of His creation. And, we're no different today than they were then. And it is useful to have sacred spaces. And that's why when we build buildings to worship God, we dedicate them to God, we pray over them, we ask God to dwell there and make it a holy place where His Spirit meets with people. And we try to make sure that we conduct sacred exercises there and use it for education, exhortation, and teaching and evangelism and fulfill His word there. But we can also do those things in your living room, in my living room. We can do them at the corner when we meet a neighbor and visit with them. We can do that in their living room even if they're not a believer. If they'll meet with us and be a man of peace, and we can open God's word with them. If they won't show up at our building, that's fine. There's nowhere we can't have people meet God. God will meet them anywhere it takes to win their hearts. And He knows who's going to be one, who's not, and He's going to meet with people where it takes to win them. On the other hand, it's very useful to have a place where everybody can gather and go, I will meet God there. So the temple was built. Solomon doesn't point out why God said that David wasn't going to be the one that built it. I'm sure he knew. I'm sure that he knew that the crowd knew. But that was not the point of this. The point of this was God fulfilled His word. And so He did. Verse 22. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said. So Solomon, after his little speech, then prays to God. This is part of the dedication that had been planned by humans. God had dedicated the temple Himself. They couldn't plan that in. God did it, and God knew when to do it before all the ceremony happened. So now here is the ceremony. Verse 23. O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like You in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep Your covenant of love with Your servants who continue wholeheartedly in Your way. You have kept Your promise to Your servant David my father. With Your mouth You have promised, and with Your hand You have fulfilled it, as it is today. Now Lord God of Israel, keep Your servant David my father the promises You made to him when You said, You shall never fail to have a man to sit before Me on the throne of Israel, if only Your sons are careful in all that they do to walk before Me as You have done. And now, O Lord of Israel, let Your word that You promised Your servant David my father come true. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain You. How much less this temple I have built? Yet give attention to Your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, O Lord my God. Hear the cry and the prayer that Your servant is praying in Your presence this day. May Your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place of which You said, My name shall be there. so that you will hear the prayer of your servant prays toward this place. Hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. When a man wrongs his neighbor and is required to take an oath, then he comes and swears the oath before your altar in this temple, then hear from heaven and act. Judge between your servants, condemn the guilty, and bring down on his own head what he has done. Declare the innocent not guilty, and so establish his innocence. When your people Israel have been defeated by an enemy because they have sinned against you, and when they turn back to you and confess your name, praying and making supplication to you in this temple, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them back to the land you gave to their fathers. And when the heavens are shut up and there is no rain because your people have sinned against you, and when they pray toward this place and confess your name, and turn from their sin because you have afflicted them, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel. Teach them the right way to live, and send rain on the land you gave your people for an inheritance. When famine or plague comes to the land, or blight, mildew, locusts, or grasshoppers, or when an enemy besieges them in any of their cities, whatever the disaster or disease may come, and when a prayer or plea is made by any of your people Israel, each one aware of the afflictions of his own heart and spreading out his hands toward this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place, forgive and act, deal with each man according to all he does, since you know his heart, for you alone know the hearts of all men, so that they will fear you all the time they live in the land you gave our fathers. As for the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, for men will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays towards this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place, and do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. When your people go to war against their enemies, wherever you send them, and when they pray to the Lord toward the city you have chosen and the temple I have built for your name, then hear from heaven their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause. And when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to the enemy who takes them captive to his own land, far away or near, and if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their conquerors, and say, we have sinned, we have done wrong, we have acted wickedly, and if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave their fathers, toward the city you have chosen, and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their plea, and uphold their case. And forgive your people who have sinned against you. Forgive all the offenses they have committed against you, and cause their conquerors to show them mercy. For they are your people and your inheritance, whom you brought out of Egypt, out of the iron smelting furnace. May your eyes be open to your servant's plea and the plea of your people Israel, and may you listen to them whenever they cry out to you. For you single them out from all the nations of the world to be your own inheritance, just as you declared through your servant Moses when you, O sovereign God, Lord, brought our fathers out of Egypt. He is making sure in his prayer that the people know God is not dwelling only in the temple, that he is dwelling in the highest heavens, that he's dwelling in the heavens. Now, he knows that the people have the idea, and it was common throughout the world, that you had to pray to your God in your temple, or at the temple, or in the temple, or toward the temple. And if you couldn't get there, you had to point to it. And let's face it, we find examples elsewhere where people would pray toward Jerusalem, pray toward the temple. Today, Muslims pray toward Mecca, and their understanding is God hears them if they're pointed in the right direction, basically. That's common in a lot of religions worldwide. That you have to pray toward the temple. If you can't get there and you're out a ways away, pray toward the temple. If you're near, go to the temple and pray there, because God will hear you better. Solomon knows that's what people are going to do. And he asks that when they pray that way, God hears, God listens, God sees. Excuse me. He tries to list all the common things that he knows people are going to pray about, and some of the more important things that they may pray about, but they should try to avoid, but excuse me, that they're going to end up doing because they're people and they sin. And God's going to have to punish his people. He's going to have to discipline them. He's going to send all kinds of disasters on them, plagues and famine and lack of rain and locusts and other agricultural disasters of all kinds and enemies that besiege them, and they're going to have to go out and fight wars. And whenever they pray, wherever they pray, he knows that the mindset of the people is they have to pray toward God. And therefore they're going to pray toward the temple. He understands that if you're out in the field, you can just pray and God will hear you. But he's asking God that if the people are making a serious attempt to worship him, that God will hear them. And their short understanding of how powerful God is does not hinder. That if they're praying there, praying toward there, if they're acknowledging that God dwells in the temple, even though he dwells everywhere, then that God should hear them. And he asks it not just of the Israelite people, but anybody and everybody in the whole world that prays there, so that God's reputation would spread throughout the whole earth. Solomon understood that the Jews were supposed to be the priests of the world and teach everybody worldwide to worship Yahweh. And so he asked that happen, and that people would turn and worship God. David, his father, had been successful at that. If you read the list of his, and we've done that before, read the list of his officials, like 10-15% of them were foreigners, but they all worshipped Yahweh. So David had been successful at spreading, and his government and the people that supported David had been successful at spreading Yahweh worship to people that weren't Israelites. And they had been integrated into the government, into the people. And in fact, honestly, after a few generations, people forgot they were no longer Israelites. They had not been Israelites to start with. They were now Israelites. And that's the way it should be. It should have been all along. God told Moses for the people not to intermarry because that would cause them to worship foreign gods. Solomon knew that, and he asked in his prayer that Solomon himself and all of his sons would continue to worship God wholeheartedly like David had, and therefore that David would always have a man on the throne there in Jerusalem. Good thing to ask for God. Solomon, you've already made a mistake. You've already married the foreign women that are worshiping other gods, and they have not started worshiping Yahweh. You did not convert them, and they will lead your heart away, and you will break this prayer. And because of that, God will say, I will destroy this place eventually. Solomon had already made the mistake. He didn't know how serious it was, and he died not even knowing how serious it was. This temple that God had indwelt would eventually be destroyed by God. He would bring up a foreign army, the Babylonian army, paradoxically, from the very place of the people that taught the Israelites how to build it, to destroy it. So, God was even in the beginning showing how he was going to work. It would take us millennia of reflection to realize this and to understand how important it was. But God knew it all along. And so, Solomon asked, and we wish he had fulfilled that prayer himself by staying pure to God. He did not. Verse 54. When Solomon had finished all these prayers and supplications of the Lord, he rose from before the altar of the Lord, where he had been kneeling with his hands spread out toward heaven. He stood and blessed the whole assembly of Israel in a loud voice, saying, Praise be the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed from all the good promises he made through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he never leave us nor forsake us. May he turn our hearts to him to walk in all his ways and to keep the commandments, decrees, and regulations he gave our fathers. And may these words of mine, which I have prayed before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, that he may uphold the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel according to each day's need, so that all the peoples of the earth may know the Lord is God, and that there is no other. But your hearts must be fully committed to the Lord our God, and live by his decrees and obey his commandments, as at this time. So after he prays to God, and he's expectant that God will answer in an affirmative, he's making sure the people understand that God's going to want to. And then he gives them the admonition that they are to be obedient to God, and that, they should be the ones obeying God. And yes, they need to. Verse 62. Then the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifices before the Lord. Solomon offered a sacrifice of fellowship offerings to the Lord, 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. So the king and all the Israelites dedicated the temple of the Lord. So at the temple then, he sacrifices this absolutely huge number of fellowship offerings. Now, fellowship offerings, the priest basically got one of the hindquarters. The inedible parts were burned on the altar, and the rest of it was cooked and distributed to the people. So Solomon is having a feast for basically the whole country. He's cooking a feast of meat for everybody. Everybody is getting to fellowship. It's obvious he, as the government, is paying for the feast. It's not the people. But, let's face it, anytime the government does something, the people have paid for it. Solomon earned a lot of his money through trade, etc., tribute, and things like that. So the people didn't pay that much taxes, but they had raised the cattle. Let's face it, he had to buy them somewhere. He didn't have that many in his ownership, and they'd been paid for it, and he is being extravagant in how he feeds people. The estimates of how many people were in the land and estimates of how much meat was there, he fed everybody a gluttonous amount of meat. If everybody in Israel, every man, woman, and child, had come to Jerusalem for the dedication of the temple, and there's no indication that they did, they would have had enough to eat. He meant to make it a joyous celebration. And, they did. People were probably, taking back to their families. Definitely within a day's journey of Jerusalem. And they were celebrating. Verse 64. On the same day, the king consecrated the middle part of the courtyard in front of the temple of the Lord, and there he offered burnt offerings, grain offerings, and the fat of the fellowship offerings, because the bronze altar before the Lord was too small to hold the burnt offerings and the grain offerings and the fat of the fellowship offerings. Well, yes, if you sacrifice 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats, that 18 by 18 foot altar is just not big enough to burn it all. The part that has to be burned. It just can't. So he dedicates the middle part of the courtyard. It is actually intended, by how they built it, to be the place where the public stands to worship God, while the priests go into the temple and do their part, and they can see the bronze altar from there, and they can see the ceremonies, but when you got that many, you just can't do it all there. So he dedicated the courtyard, and apparently it had been planned, not, he had developed a careful plan. He knew how many sheep and goats he had available and to offer to sacrifice, and knew that bronze altar wasn't going to handle it, and so he had the priest dedicate that area, and they did it there, and that was a big enough area to burn that much, and every animal had a grain and wine offering that went with it, so that's a whole bunch of sacrifice and a whole bunch of grain. Depending upon what it was a small handful or pinch, or some of the grain. And the rest of it was made into a meal for the people. But, it's still, it's a bunch. And so he'd planned it well. And they used the middle courtyard as the place where the sacrifices were burned, as well as the altar. Verse 65. So Solomon observed the festival at that time, and all Israel with him, a vast assembly, people from the Lebo Hamath to the Wadi of Egypt. So they celebrated the Passover, and that is the month of the Passover. He picked that time because Israel should assemble at Jerusalem to celebrate it at the temple. And so the dedication of the temple being at the Passover makes sense. And he observed the Passover with everybody, and they came from the very far north, that was the extent of Israel, to the Wadi of Egypt, the very south end of what was Israelite territory. That was the border with Egypt. And people from everywhere came, is the point. Middle of verse 65. They celebrated it before the Lord our God for 7 days and 7 days more, 14 days in all. On the following day he sent the people away. They blessed the king and then went home, joyful and glad in heart for all the good things that the Lord had done for his servant David and his people Israel. So they celebrated the Passover for 2 weeks instead of the normal 1 week for this dedication of the temple. So they dedicated the temple in grand style. They worshiped God in grand style. And there was a very real chance that they had depopulated the entire countryside and everybody come to Jerusalem to worship. You know, when I said they could have realistically fed all of Israel, every man, woman, child. Well, if they knew and Solomon had properly announced it, essentially everybody came to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication of the temple and the Passover. The Passover should have been being celebrated every year. There is good evidence that a lot of people didn't celebrate it every year. They might have been spotty in celebrating it, and they didn't go up to Jerusalem every year to celebrate it. A lot of people celebrated it where they were. They just didn't go. They didn't go to the tabernacle. They didn't go to Shiloh. They didn't go to wherever the dedication was. They celebrated where they were. If they had a priest or a Levite or somebody that celebrated near them, they would go there and they would do it small and local, and they didn't go assemble as a group. With King Solomon, at this point in time, they came to Jerusalem and celebrated it at the temple, and basically he fed everybody for 2 weeks. He had a big party for people that they could see the temple and they could be dedicated. They could dedicate it. And so he has set it up like we set up a church and pray over it and dedicate it to God and ask God to make it a holy place and a place where we minister. He has done that with the temple. In fact, a lot of our model of how we do that is based on how he set up and dedicated the temple. And he did that with careful research and careful planning. Holy Father, help us to recognize that anytime we set up a place to worship you, we've set up sacred space, and that we treat it as sacred, that 3801 McCart Avenue becomes a sacred spot because we meet with you there, that any other church building becomes sacred space, and we treat it with the proper respect. We use it correctly to honor you and worship you and do your work, whether that's ministering to other people, blessing other people, telling other people about you, teaching, proclaiming your word, planning, Lord, that we would treat you as other and high and lifted up and holy and separate, and that we are your servants and you are the Lord and you are the one in charge. Have us to dedicate to do your things and do it your way and not do it however seems right to us, but that we would obey you. And Lord, I ask that we would obey you our whole life and not be like Solomon, who turned aside later and failed to fulfill the promise he knew he should make. Lord, help us to be those people who follow you wholeheartedly our whole lives. In your holy name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, January 24th, 2024. This was recorded on Sunday, January 14th, 2024, when y'all are seeing this, I will be out camping. Frankie and I will be at Galveston Island State Park, enjoying the beach and camping on the beach. Our campsite is on the beach. Going to be interesting. I think the last time I camped on the beach, I was 8. So it's been 55 years. And we're gonna enjoy ourselves. We're beginning to see the weather forecast, and it's definitely going to be warmer there than here, and I appreciate that. The dogs and I had 2 or 3 really chilly walks today, and I plan walks tomorrow and Tuesday, where I'm supposed to be off Tuesday. We'll see if that happens. If the weather gets bad, work has said they were going to pick me up, bring me in. I'll be off a different day. But y'all have a blessed week. I hope to see you at church next Sunday. I hope to see you Wednesday, where we'll discuss chapter 7. And if not, we'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.